They were films meant to dazzle, stories meant to challenge, images meant to burn themselves into the public's imagination forever. But instead, they were silenced, hidden away, shamed into the shadows of vaults and censorship boards. In the glittering promise of old Hollywood, there existed a dangerous undercurrent, an arms race between art and morality. Studios pushed the limits, desperate to capture the rawest parts of life: lust, greed, cruelty, desire. And in doing so, they crossed invisible lines drawn by a nation still clinging to a vision of innocence. Some films simply offended, others incited outrage, and a few struck so deeply at the heart of American sensibilities that they were destroyed, banned in entire states, locked away overseas, and in some cases, never fully restored to what they once were. They weren't just stories on celluloid, they were weapons capable of toppling careers, bankrupting studios, and shaking the very foundation of Hollywood's golden empire. Tonight, we step back into a time when the silver screen dared to be dangerous and paid the ultimate price. These are the banned films that almost destroyed old Hollywood. Chapter 1. The Birth of Censorship, the Arbuckle Affair. The year was 1921. Hollywood was still young, still intoxicating the nation with moving pictures that felt like magic spells. Stars weren't just celebrities, they were demigods, untouchable and adored. And no star shone brighter than Roscoe "Fatty" Arbuckle. He was the man who could make America laugh with nothing more than a raised eyebrow or a pratfall. On screen, he was a gentle giant, the beloved clown. Off screen, he was one of the highest-paid men in the world, pulling in a staggering $1 million contract. An astronomical figure in the jazz age, he was, to the studios, an investment worth protecting at any cost. But on Labor Day weekend in San Francisco, all of that unraveled in the time it took for a rumor to take root. Arbuckle had rented 3 luxury suites at the St. Francis Hotel, inviting friends, showgirls, and fellow actors for a raucous party. Jazz blared, liquor flowed freely. Prohibition be damned, and in the haze of champagne and cigarette smoke, a young aspiring actress named Virginia Rapp collapsed. Within days, headlines screamed of something far more sinister than a tragic illness. She was dead, and the whispers claimed Arbuckle had assaulted her, an accusation that, whether proven or not, would become the first major celebrity scandal in American history. The newspapers feasted on it. Publishers like William Randolph Hearst knew exactly how to sell outrage. Hearst himself would later admit that the Arbuckle trial sold more papers than the sinking of the Lusitania. Suddenly, America wasn't just consuming films, it was consuming Hollywood gossip in its most scandalous, sordid form. What followed was a trio of trials. The first ended in a hung jury, the second in a mistrial, and the third, after endless public vilification, acquitted Arbuckle entirely, declaring his innocence in the strongest possible terms. But by then, it didn't matter. The public had already tried him in the court of opinion. His films were pulled from theaters. Studios cut ties. In the end, Hollywood had sacrificed one of its brightest stars in an effort to save itself. This was the moment the studio moguls realized something chilling. The industry's survival depended not just on producing hits, but on protecting its image. And that meant one thing: control. Enter Will Hayes, a former U.S. Postmaster General and moral crusader, hired to restore Hollywood's dignity. His mission was clear: prevent scandal at all costs, even if it meant rewriting the very rules of what could be shown on screen. From that moment on, censorship wasn't just an occasional inconvenience. It became the silent law of the land, and the real battle between creativity and morality had only just begun. Chapter 2. The Pre-Code Recklessness. The 1920s had been a decade of champagne-soaked rebellion. But the early 1930s were something else entirely. It was as if Hollywood, sensing the tightening grip of the moral gatekeepers, decided to push every boundary it could, one last wild sprint before the leash was pulled. This was the pre-code era, a brief, intoxicating window from the dawn of sound in the late 1920s until the summer of 1934. And in those few years, the silver screen became a mirror for all the things polite society pretended didn't exist. Movies were sharp, dangerous, unapologetically adult. They reveled in suggestive dialogue, silk nightgowns, and lingering camera shots that dared audiences to imagine what happened after the lights went out. Characters, especially women, were allowed to be ambitious, sensual, and morally complicated. Gangsters weren't just villains, they were folk heroes. Love triangles didn't always end in weddings. Marriage wasn't sacred, and sin wasn't always punished. In the smoky nightclubs of films like Night Nurse and Babyface, Barbara Stanwyck would smirk across a room, her eyes shimmering with the suggestion of power. In Red-Headed Woman, Jean Harlow didn't simply seduce, she conquered, unapologetically using her beauty and cunning to climb the social ladder. These weren't women waiting to be rescued. They were women who made the rules. But for every audience member thrilled by this newfound honesty, there were others who felt deeply threatened. America was in the grip of the Great Depression. Families were desperate, churches were full, and many believed the nation's moral fabric was already fraying. To them, Hollywood wasn't just entertaining, it was corrupting. State censorship boards multiplied. Religious organizations, most notably the Legion of Decency, began openly condemning films they deemed immoral, urging parishioners to boycott theaters. The tension between art and morality tightened with every release. It was a time of boldness, yes, but also of risk, and when filmmakers pushed too far, they found themselves in the crosshairs of censors ready to make examples of them. Few films illustrate this better than Todd Browning's 1932 Horror Freaks, a picture so shocking that it would be banned in multiple countries, pulled from theaters within weeks, and nearly end the career of one of Hollywood's most imaginative directors. Chapter 3. Freaks, 1932. In 1932, MGM was at the height of its power. A studio of marble hallways, gleaming office doors, and a reputation for family-friendly prestige, which is why it remains one of Hollywood's great mysteries, how Freaks was ever greenlit. Todd Browning, the film's director, was no stranger to the macabre. He had shocked audiences just a year earlier with Dracula, turning Bela Lugosi into an icon. But Freaks was something far more unsettling, because it blurred the line between fiction and reality in a way audiences were simply not prepared for. Based loosely on a short story called Spurs, the film told the tale of a beautiful trapeze artist who marries a sideshow dwarf for his fortune, only to plot his murder. But Browning made one bold, irreversible choice. He cast real circus performers, people with physical disabilities, conjoined twins, those labeled human oddities by the carnival world. These were not actors in makeup. They were real individuals who had spent their lives on the fringes of society. The result was unlike anything audiences had ever seen. There were moments of tenderness, glimpses of a community protecting one of their own. But there was also a final act of revenge so shocking, so grotesque in its imagery, that many theatergoers reportedly fainted or fled before the credits rolled. The backlash was immediate and ferocious. Studio executives panicked after disastrous test screenings. Scenes were slashed. The original runtime was gutted from 90 minutes to barely over an hour. Even then, the damage was done. MGM pulled the film from distribution after only a brief release. In Britain, Freaks was banned for over 30 years. In several U.S. cities, local censors refused to license it. Lawsuits were threatened, and the film's advertising had to be rewritten to soften its impact. For MGM, it was more than a box office flop. It was an embarrassment. Browning, once one of their most valuable directors, never recovered his career's momentum. Yet beneath the horror lay a subversive truth. Freaks was not really about deformity. It was about cruelty, hypocrisy, and the dangerous ease with which normal society could become monstrous. That was the real reason it struck so deeply. It forced audiences to see themselves in the villains, not the victims. Decades later, critics would hail it as a masterpiece of outsider cinema, a film that dared to humanize those Hollywood usually relegated to the background. But in 1932, it was simply too much, too soon, and it pushed MGM and the rest of Hollywood one step closer to fully embracing the iron fist of censorship. Next came a film that didn't horrify audiences with deformity or revenge, but with charm, charisma, and the dangerous glamour of crime itself. Howard Hughes's Scarface would prove that sometimes charm could be more dangerous than horror. Chapter 4. Scarface, 1932. The year Freaks scandalized audiences, another film was quietly stirring a different kind of outrage, one that would ignite a war between a billionaire producer and America's moral watchdogs. Howard Hughes was not a man accustomed to compromise. Young, fabulously wealthy, and already notorious for pushing boundaries in both aviation and cinema, he was drawn to the gangster genre like a moth to a flame. The headlines of the era were dominated by real-life outlaws. Al Capone, John Dillinger, men who had become folk heroes in the midst of Prohibition. Hughes wanted to capture that electricity, bottle it in celluloid, and unleash it on the public. The result was Scarface, a brutal, unapologetic portrait of organized crime. Directed by Howard Hawks, the film told the story of Tony Camonte, a ruthless gangster who rises to power through charm, violence, and sheer ambition. From the first gunshot to the last, the film refused to moralize. Tony's charisma was intoxicating, his lifestyle decadent, his crimes thrilling to watch, and that, precisely, was the problem. City and state censorship boards erupted in fury. The film, they argued, glorified crime, made gangsters look like rock stars instead of villains. The New York censor demanded extensive cuts. Chicago, fearing the film's parallels to Al Capone, banned it outright. In several states, it could only be shown under a different title, such as Scarface, the shame of the nation. Even then, boards insisted on reshoots to add moralistic speeches condemning gang violence, along with an alternate ending in which Tony dies not in a blaze of glory but quietly in police custody, robbed of his mythic aura. Howard Hughes fought back with all the stubborn pride of a man who'd built an empire on defying convention. He challenged censors in court, refused to accept some of the edits, and at one point simply bypassed official distribution channels, sending prints of the original cut directly to willing theaters. The battle dragged on for over a year, costing Hughes money, patience, and political goodwill. When it finally reached audiences, Scarface was still a sensation, violent, stylish, and dangerously seductive. But its controversy solidified the belief among moral crusaders that Hollywood was incapable of policing itself. Every banned scene, every headline about censorship, was another piece of ammunition for those calling for strict, enforceable rules on what could be shown to the public. In the wake of Scarface, the message to filmmakers was clear. It wasn't enough for the villain to lose in the final reel. He had to be humiliated, punished, stripped of all glamour. The audience had to leave not admiring him, but feeling morally superior. Hollywood's leash was getting shorter, and when a 1934 medical drama dared to whisper about one of the most taboo subjects of the era, the leash would snap tight. The result was the end of the pre-code era and the official reign of the production code. Chapter 5. Men in White, 1934. By 1934, the tension between Hollywood and its critics had reached a fever pitch. The Arbuckle scandal had planted the seed. The pre-code era had watered it with scandalous stories. Freaks had shocked the public conscience, and Scarface had been the final dare. The moral crusaders were no longer content to simply shout from pulpits and editorial pages. They were ready to take the reins, and then came Men in White. On the surface, it was hardly the kind of picture you'd expect to ignite a firestorm. Produced by MGM, it was a hospital drama starring the studio's rising matinee idol, Clark Gable. He played a young, idealistic doctor, torn between his duty to patients and his personal life. The film's visual style was restrained. Its dialogue was crisp and professional. There were no gangsters, no half-dressed showgirls, no grotesque carnival acts, but nestled quietly in its storyline was a single, explosive plot point, one that the censors could not ignore. Midway through the film, Gable's character becomes romantically involved with a nurse, played by Myrna Loy. She falls pregnant. The words pregnancy or abortion are never uttered. The scene is couched in euphemisms, coded pauses, and knowing glances, but the implication was unmistakable. The nurse undergoes an illegal abortion, and the emotional fallout drives much of the drama that follows. To 1934 audiences, especially the newly formed Catholic Legion of Decency, this was an unforgivable breach of moral decorum. Abortion wasn't just taboo, it was a topic forbidden from even whispering in public discourse. The Legion declared the film morally objectionable and called for boycotts of any theater that dared show it. In some states, the film was yanked from screens entirely. MGM scrambled to control the damage. Scenes were trimmed to make the implication vaguer. Posters were toned down, but it was too late. The controversy was already being held up as proof that Hollywood was out of control. In July of that year, the Production Code Administration, helmed by Joseph Breen, was given real power to enforce the rules that had been sitting largely idle for 4 years. For the first time, no film could be released without a seal of approval. Scripts were reviewed before cameras rolled. Finished films were chopped, rewritten, or shelved entirely if they dared step outside the boundaries of what Breen's office considered morally acceptable. With that, the pre-code era was dead. The reign of the Hays Code had truly begun, and for the next 3 decades it would dictate exactly how love, crime, violence, and sin could appear on screen. But as history would show, no set of rules, no matter how strict, could entirely extinguish the urge to tell dangerous stories. The banned films of old Hollywood didn't just fade away. They survived in vaults, whispered about in private screenings, waiting for a time when audiences could finally see them for what they truly were. The leash tightens. Hollywood under lock and key. By the end of 1934, Hollywood looked the same on the surface, its grand studios still gleaming under the California sun, its premieres still drawing crowds in tuxedos and silk gowns. But behind closed doors, the walls had closed in. Scripts that once dared to flirt with danger were now smoothed over, their sharp edges filed down. A gangster's final moments no longer roared with defiance. They ended with whimpers and handcuffs. Women like Barbara Stanwyck's Babyface could no longer seduce their way up the corporate ladder without paying for it in the final reel. Even animated characters. Betty Boop, once a flirty jazz-age flapper, was sewn into modest dresses, her jazz rhythms softened into nursery rhymes. The message was clear. The moral gatekeepers had won. The forbidden legacy, but winning came at a cost. In banishing the scandal, Hollywood also banished a raw honesty that had briefly flickered on its screens. Freaks had dared to say that deformity wasn't monstrous, cruelty was. Scarface had dared to admit that power and charisma can seduce even the purest hearts. Men in white had dared to acknowledge that abortion was not a whispered fantasy but a painful reality. To the censors, these films were dangerous. To history, they were courageous. Ironically, the very act of banning them only made them more powerful. They became whispered legends, traded among collectors, screened privately for the lucky few. And when, decades later, they re-emerged into the light, restored, studied, celebrated, they carried with them the weight of all the years they'd been silenced. Old Hollywood nearly lost itself in that tug-of-war between art and morality, but the battle left something behind, a permanent reminder that cinema is not just entertainment. It is provocation, it is temptation, it is truth, even when truth makes us uncomfortable. And for every locked vault, every reel cut to pieces, every film smothered by the hand of censorship, there remains the promise that stories will find a way to be told. Because film, like memory, cannot be killed. It can only be buried, and one day, unearthed again. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and comment down below as it helps support this channel. Also, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell to get notified of our newest videos. Thanks for watching.